All right, hey everybody. Just a second here, and we'll get just waiting for George to get logged on, and we'll get the interview started. Thanks for your patience. Good morning, Susan. Glad you could join us. Good morning, George. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Is the volume okay on your side of things?
Let's see here. Just messing with my phone here. Can you turn up just a little bit?
Sure thing. How is that? Is that better?
I think that works, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so welcome everybody. This is our second installment of interviewing the great George Colligan. If you're not familiar with George and his playing, number one, shame on you. Number two, on the post at the beginning of this, it has a little bit of his backstory, a tiny bit that I took from his website, and also there's a bunch of stuff you can find on Wikipedia, but he's a very profound pianist and composer and trumpeter and drummer and musician and educator, and we're glad to have you back with us, George. And this is the second one. The first one we did, the sound issues were a little bit weird. It's on YouTube. At least my sound issues from where I'm talking is kind of weird, but everything George had to say came out clear as a bell, and he had some wonderful things to say. And so this interview is a continuation of that. It kind of picks up where the last one left off. So if you haven't yet watched the first one, go check it out because George has some really cool information to pass along to everybody. So what we're going to do today is, thank you, Susan. What we're going to do today is continue on where we left off. So George, number one, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Kareem.
Right on. So we talked about you were in Baltimore, you were practicing quite a bit and getting things together, practicing for 48 hours. You had seen Jeff Keezer playing at Bradley's, and you're like, man, if somebody that age who's younger than me can get this together, why can't I? And that kind of pushed you to really get things going on. And you had been playing a little bit with Gary Bartz and Gary Thomas, and you had gone to Europe with Gary Thomas and played for all these audiences, massive audiences that were really appreciating what you were doing. And you were saying, well, you know, playing in restaurants is great and all, but I want to be doing something where people are really listening and appreciating what I'm doing. And that was kind of the impetus for you to move to New York, and that's where we kind of started running out of time. So would you be willing to pick up where we left off at that point in your career?
Sure. I suppose that is going back now. We have now 25 years to fill. But yeah, so I moved to New York, you know, and it was sort of a transition because I was living with somebody in Washington, D.C., and I ended up moving out of her apartment into my mother's apartment, into my mother's house where I grew up briefly, just to kind of, you know, I knew that I had to go to New York, but it was sort of, you know, most people don't move somewhere without some kind of like very clear job, you know. So the idea of moving to New York to be a musician or to, you know, get on the scene is so risky, you know. It's so precarious. It's just there's a lot of faith involved, and I think for any musician that makes a move related to this idea of I could do this, or these things are possible, you know, it's another one of the ways that being a freelancer and being an artist is so different from other types of careers. You know what I mean? Like most people, they get their degree, they apply for jobs, and they get accepted for a job, and they go and do that, most people who are moving now or whenever, that's what they do. But I didn't have anything concrete. It was just kind of an idea that's what I should be doing. And a lot of my friends were living there. They had moved a few years earlier.
But at this time, you had already kind of established yourself and your reputation as, a really well-known player in the Baltimore, Washington area, correct?
Well, I was active. But at that point, I still felt like I was learning. Like I was sort of like a precocious youngster, and I gained a lot of experience as a freelancer. I played with everybody that could be played with, and I was starting to play with more national groups. But I mean, that's the thing about the East Coast, I think, is in the 90s, the level was so high and there were so many working players that it wasn't like, when somebody when they're like the best in their high school and then they go somewhere else, it's like I didn't feel like I was necessarily like the best in the area. I felt like I was holding my own and I was active, and I made the choice for myself, like I need to try this, and also the idea that would make me better, so but I still kind of had an idea of where I was in terms of like DC and Baltimore. I didn't feel like I was the greatest thing since sliced bread. I mean, just because there's always somebody who's great. I mean, there's tons of great. I mean, I remember my friend David Efros. He needed to get a sub one night. This is probably like 1991, maybe 1990. He needed to get a sub for a gig on a Sunday night. It was like more of a jazzy gig that he wanted to do. So he was trying to find a sub at the last minute, and he called 60 bass players, and the 61st bass player was available. So you know what I'm saying? Like in the Baltimore, Washington area
too.
Yeah, they were, but I think that the West Coast, Pacific Northwest is a bit. I have a feeling it's always been a little bit of a smaller. And I think that the East Coast scene has contracted a bit, but there were 62 gigs that night for bass players to do. That's pretty amazing,
Yeah.
So anyway, but when I moved, one of the reasons I didn't move was because I was afraid of New York. Did I tell the subway story last time?
No, we left off like you had just gone to Europe with Gary Thomas, and we didn't really get into New York. We said, well, let's cut it off here, and we'll resume here. So we haven't really gotten to New York yet. You were just getting ready to move. Like that was the impetus to move to New York. Yeah,
well, the thing is, I mean, my parents were New Yorkers, and I had visited New York a number of times, but there was one visit to New York in 1990, friend. And to make a long story short, somebody attacked me on the subway, and it was not a pleasant experience. Not that it was the worst thing in the world, but it was just sort of like you don't expect to take a trip to New York and then have something happen to you. You know what I mean? It's like you're sort of like, oh, I'm just here for the jazz, not to have somebody, punch me in the head, that type of thing. So, so I probably would have moved sooner if I had not had that experience. It just kind of freaked me out. But eventually, I mean, again, this sort of speaks to the level of making choices in your life, like what's important to you. And I felt as though trying to get over my fear was had to be reckoned with in order to make the scene in New York. That's me wanting to do music on the highest level superseded my fears, and eventually, and New York changed a lot from, post 80s. New York was so different in the 70s and 80s. I mean, it was not the the wealthy person's paradise that it is now, you know.
Well, it was run by the mob at that time. What they're kind of looking at now, a lot of that was, you know.
Oh man, I would love to talk about that, because I watch all these documentaries on the mafia, and that's the one thing people don't realize, is that the five families totally ruled New York in the 70s and 80s, and they were impossible to bring down. And I mean, you know, this is getting into politics. I think Rudy Giuliani needs serious mental help at this point, but they forget his claim to fame was that he took on the mob. He indicted all five of the heads of the five families all at once. That was sort of unprecedented, and it was like really a passion of his to bring down the mafia. I still think that there's organized crime in New York, but it's on a much lower level. They just don't have the influence, you know.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating history, and certainly as a fan of The Sopranos, as you know, which a lot of my students have never even heard of at this point, but you know. Anyway, I guess we're getting off on track. But so I moved to Brooklyn, and the first place I lived was had 5 or 6 roommates, and this was in Park Slope, Brooklyn. And so I had a room that was about the size of a closet. I had enough room for a futon and my keyboard and some clothes. And I think I paid like $150 a month, and I lived there for a while. But I didn't care. I mean, I was like, I know why I'm here. I'm not here to, you know, live a life of luxury. I'm here to, you know. And so the other thing about living in New York at that point was I was not. Nobody knew who I was. I was sort of trying to make the rounds. I would go out to hear music a lot. I'd go to Bradley's. I'd go to Sweet Basil's. You know, Visiones. I'd try to hit as many spots as I could, and just to hear the music. I mean, you know, once you start hearing, not just like the famous people, because you could go to Sweet Basil's and hear McCoy Tyner, you could hear Kenny Garrett, you could hear Fort Apache, you could hear, I mean, anybody. Everybody plays Sweet Basil's, and they would play the whole week, so you could even go back multiple times and hear the same group and how different it would be. You know, Bradley's. You know, there were a lot of like week-long gigs, a lot like the Vanguard. You know, I'd go to the Vanguard too. There's so many places. I think at this point Smalls maybe hadn't even. No, Smalls was there. That's right, because I did my first gig as a leader at Smalls in like late 1995. Pretty sure.
Was Spike opened it and ran it from the beginning? Is that correct?
No, Spike wasn't involved at all. Spike took it over later. I think they had sort of closed for a while, but Spike had some financial fortune, and he ended up taking it over. I think he was one of the people that played there, because he's a really fine pianist.
For those of you who don't know who we're talking about the pianist Spike Milner, who owns and operates Smalls in New York right now. And so if you get a chance, go to their website, check them out, and support them, because they can use it, and they're a strong fixture of the jazz community in New York at this time.
Yeah, I love Smalls. I mean, in fact, I would have to say that I've played there when it was Mitch. Like Mitch Borden was sort of booking it and controlling it, and it was a bit run down. It was like there'd be people like living behind the piano and stuff. It was a little bit of a different atmosphere, you know. It's still very, you know, what's the word? It's not like glamorous. Say what?
Charming.
It's got a certain charm to it, but it was more charming back then, you know. It was musically it was a little bit more on one path. It was like very straight ahead. Like they sort of didn't want you around if you weren't playing a certain way, you know. So I think Spike has expanded the possibility. I mean, it's still within a certain type of jazz, you know, but I think it's much more expansive, the type of people that are playing there, you know. But anyway, I was trying to make the scene, but I didn't have enough work really to, you know, just in New York. I was starting to kind of do some touring and do a few things here and there. but I also would drive back to DC and Baltimore quite a bit. Like at a certain point, it felt like every weekend I was going back to work with a singer or work with whoever, and just to make some money and then go back to New York. So I did that probably for at least the first year I was there, kind of off and on. And I mean, eventually I had to get rid of my car because it was just impossible to park in Park Slope. And but I would take the train sometimes or the bus, you know. Yeah, I mean, then I lived in another place where I had only 3 roommates. And so that was a little better, little bigger room, still kind of a small, like a child's room, like a tiny child's room. Still basically had enough room for my futon and my keyboard and some clothes. And, you know, these were like Berklee grads. All the people that I sort of was surrounded by were people that went to Berklee. And I remember sort of, because I had thought about going to Berklee when I was at Peabody. I would get these brochures about Berklee. It looked really awesome, like just go and study jazz. And I had these fantasies of becoming a drummer, just, you know, forget it, you know, quitting trumpet and just playing drums and going to Berklee. I figured maybe this would make more sense, you know. So these were, you know, the first place I lived was almost all Berklee people. And the Berklee people kind of always had their own clique, you know. It's like they really networked with each other and they supported each other. And, you know, all really cool people. But I always was like, oh, I'm the guy that didn't go to Berklee. You know, that sort of thing. So, yeah, so I lived in this one place. And I remember that, you know, my roommates at the time, you know, I think because I didn't go to Berklee, they were just surprised that I was getting any gigs at all. And so we shared this is kind of a funny story. We shared an answering machine. This is way before, I don't even know if people had beepers really at this point. Maybe some people. But,
some
you know,
people
we
don't
had
even know
to
what
share.
you're talking about, right?
Say what? Yeah, beeper, you know.
Know what you're talking about.
Right. So anyway, so we shared an answering machine. And I was getting calls, like Buster Williams was calling, you know, and Gary Bartz was calling. And so my roommates had to hear that, which is kind of awkward. And they were just like, man, this guy just moved here. He's getting called. And so the final straw was that I got a call from Tony Williams, not the drummer. And I don't know if he's still alive. There's an alto player in Philadelphia named Tony Williams. And he called me for some gigs. And so they were just like, man, Tony Williams is calling this guy, you know. So that was sort of, you know, I was like, it's not the real Tony, you know. So that was sort of awkward, I guess, you know. And it was, I don't know, it was weird after a while having a bunch of roommates, you know. I mean, I would say we mostly got along, but I sort of felt like it'd be nice to have my own place. One of the roommates had some serious drug issues, which was definitely an education in that. I suppose that, you know, that's part of the history, you know, is you have a lot of the greats ended up, you know, having much shorter lives, or some were able to recover, but, you know, that's kind of a sad part of the history of jazz is people just sort of succumbing to substance abuse. But anyway, so I finally got my own place. This is probably 96 or 7. But still, like, so basically for, you know, the next 5 years, I was sort of in and around Park Slope, you know, that general vicinity, kind of in and out. Actually, that's not true. Up until I'd say 2004, I was in Brooklyn, and then I ended up moving to Queens eventually. But I guess I'll get to that. So, I don't know. I feel like in a way I moved to New York kind of on the tail end of something really great. Like I said, it was a leap of faith to move there with nothing. So this idea that like you could, like that I had the potential to do something, you know, not knowing exactly what, but thinking, oh, well, maybe Gary Bartz will have work, you know, maybe Buster will have work, maybe Gary Thomas will have work, maybe somebody else will have some work. But it just seemed like it was going to snowball, and I was willing to trust that. It just seemed to make sense, you know. And obviously with no children and, you know, only having to take care of myself, I didn't have any incredible financial needs. So I didn't have to worry about money in the same way, you know. And I sort of felt like I always had enough work. Like I never felt like, I mean, you always get nervous, but I never felt like, oh, I'm going to have to go into debt or, you know, move back in with my mother or some point. At some point, I always felt at least I had a baseline. Let's see. So, I mean, a lot of it is just so I felt like somebody asked me recently, a younger person who used to be a student at Portland State, sort of asking about the 90s. Like, what were the 90s like, you know? Old man, what's it? and I said, I feel like everything before 9/11 was just better and more relaxed, and there wasn't this kind of fear, you know.
Well, it seems kind of like the 90s, particularly for jazz, there was that window of like everyone's like the young lions, you know, like Joshua Redmond was on the scene, and Roy Hargrove and Antonio Hart and Greg Hutchinson. All those guys were young. Christian McBride, you know, all those guys were, I mean, they'd been around, but there was a lot of that. And then that seems like, I mean, partly I guess you could chalk that up to like marketing. They were making money off of that, and there was more money to be had in the scene. It seems like, and this is just my opinion, and you know far better than I do, but even in other countries, it seems like there's less financial support for gigs. Like Japan, for example, it seems like they had an issue where there's a lot of things happening, and then all of a sudden, if you talk to people now, it's much more difficult to get work there just because the economy is not as strong. And it seems that way to a point here in the United States as well. Would you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think that we're, I mean, again, this is just my own anecdotal evidence, my own personal experience, and obviously this is the worst time to judge that, but I just felt like in the 90s there were just more possibilities. It just seemed wide open. It seemed like a lot of cats were working, and it seemed like there was still, but this was the point where I think record companies were starting to decide that maybe, you know, financing all these jazz musicians didn't make any sense, you know. I mean, and, you know, you could use as an example of maybe where the cutoff was when Norah Jones became, you know, when she got her big breakout. All of a sudden it was like, oh, maybe we should start supporting people who actually can sell records, you know, rather than just, you know, saying, oh, we have these great new stars, you know, and having to sort of put a lot behind it to support them. I think that the recording industry didn't really want to see it through because, you know, jazz is complicated music. It's not pop music. And I think even marketing it a certain way isn't necessarily going to make it palatable. I think it's still a niche market, you know.
I know.
So,
well, at the end of the 90s, that's when I first met, you know, drummer Ollie Jackson. He was living out here at the time and married to a gal out here. And we were talking about the record industry and clubs and economics of it all. And he was talking about even that, you know, what the general public doesn't know is a lot of that is manipulated, even the polls and record sales. For example, you know, there used to be Warner Brothers had a jazz label, which has since been dissolved. And a lot of the artists that were on that label, I'm not going to name names, but he was saying when a certain artist came out that they really wanted to push on a given instrument, they had other artists on that same instrument on the roster. They said, you're not allowed to release any albums until this person gets his album out and it gets up in the polls because they want to push them. So basically, even that's manipulated so that they can actually get ratings and win polls and be like, the DownBeat winner and sold the most albums, you know. So it's controlled to that extent as well, which, and also at the same time to consider around that, you know, the whole Napster thing, and now we have Spotify and all this stuff where musicians don't make as much album sales and royalties. You know, I mean, there's all those things working against it, you know, in 2020. In the 90s, those major problems or roadblocks didn't exist yet.
Right. Well, I mean, in terms of how musicians made money, that was different. You know, there was still, I mean, well, people were still buying records. I mean, there was no streaming at that point, and there wasn't even the whole idea of downloading stuff. I mean, I remember when downloading was only seen as like something illegal. It's like, oh, find this record for free. You could find, you know, certain things like somebody had burned them and put them in a file. But now it's like streaming or just looking on YouTube. Like there's so much content being given away for free that's not, it's only earning income for YouTube or Google or what, you know what I mean? It's the people who own these streaming services are making money, and we're not. We're definitely not. So that was different than 80s and 90s. You could still really make some money in music. And whether you could do that in jazz, I mean, I think still people did a lot of touring, but you could also sell, like there was a mechanism to sell CDs and sell albums. And so that was just still a thing. And you still had people like Cassandra Wilson, who, you know, this is before Norah Jones, but I believe Cassandra was really the top seller, you know, mid to late 90s. And I started working with her in 99. So I worked with her like 99 through 2001. And that was arguably the height of her career. You know, she had kind of a hit. She did that Monkees song, Last Train to Clarksville. And that generated a lot of interest. And so then she had done this record, Traveling Miles. And so her tours were like really great. Like she was doing all huge venues in Europe and Japan. And, you know, but she was selling at the time, I guess she, like in the 90s, from what I'm told, like a sort of successful record had to sell at least 20,000 copies, you know, any kind of jazz record, you know. But she was selling maybe under 500,000 copies, and that was considered amazing for a jazz artist. So, but then I guess Norah Jones came around and sold like 8 million, and then it was like, why are we messing around with people who merely sell, you know, 400,000, you know, that sort of thing. So, I think that kind of changed how the label, you know. Because I think it used to be really that a lot of it was considered a write-off. You know what I mean? It wasn't like a lot of artists that you think of as successful, you know, you find out, oh, the label never made any money off of them. You know, there's a really interesting book that it's been years since I read it, but it's called Howling at the Moon by Walter Yetnikoff. I don't know if you know this book, but it's about the industry, and it's about his time at Columbia Records. And it's mostly just about his partying and his drug use, you know, as a record exec. And then he says, oh, I'm also tone deaf. I don't really have an ear for music, but I was responsible for Michael Jackson and for Bruce Springsteen and Miles. He talks about Miles. He was like, oh, I loved Miles, but Miles never made any money for us. You know what I mean? It's like just the way they see things. I mean, from what I remember, I think the same was with Weather Report. Like Weather Report always had to sort of be supported. Like they didn't make any real money for the label. At least that's how the label person would see it, you know. So
that's what I'm sure you probably read this book as a pianist, but it's Possibilities by Herbie Hancock. Have you read this book?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he talks about that, like all these projects that he had, like the Headhunters and Wandishi and all that stuff. Basically, what financed a lot of his stuff throughout his career was royalties from Watermelon Man. That was, you know,
yes,
a huge hit. And even like all these other projects were wonderful, but were not, you know, money makers for him, which I thought was interesting to see.
It's always interesting to look behind the scenes, because when you hear music that's really powerful, you know, and I would do this from time to time, like you sort of listen, like you listen to Clifford Brown and you just, like I didn't have any books on Clifford Brown. There's one biography about him, and apparently he was, I mean, he had a very short life, but you know, you listen to him, you sort of wonder, you start to make assumptions, you know, you're like, oh, he must be an amazing person, you know. Just listen to him play. He must have been like the coolest guy. Like you just get this feeling of like, oh, it's like some kind of Jesus figure or something, you know. And you really have no idea. He could be a total jerk, you know. So, and then you come to find that about a lot of musicians. You're like, oh, they're so great, and then you find out, oh yeah, he was a total jerk, you know, whatever. So, you know, it's so when, like with M1Dishi, for example, I really enjoyed those records. I mean, I didn't understand it at first, but you know, when I was like signing records out of the library in the early 80s, I signed out Sextant, which was one of the M1Dishi records. And I remember thinking like, man, this is, because I really liked the cover. It was like what they call the Afrofuturistic covers. I mean, in a way, it's a lot like Bitches Brew cover. But all the M1Dishi covers are kind of like that. It's almost like some of the Parliament covers. Like they're really interesting artwork, you know. And so I remember putting it on and thinking like, this is some weird stuff. But I was kind of into weird stuff. So I was like, this is really cool. It's like, I don't even know if this is jazz or not, but this says Herbie Hancock. So, you know, but see, I had heard Headhunters before that, you know. So I was like, well, this is, so I didn't really understand the timeline at that point. But from what and I know a bunch of the people that played in M1Dishi, you know, Buster, Benny Maupin. I actually played with Julian Priester once, who's super nice. Billy Hart, of course. And the stories they tell me are so, it's not because you hear this music and you're like, oh, this is great. You just think of it as great music and you think these must be great people making great music. And you don't even think of like, what did it take to make this project happen, you know? Oh, Eddie Henderson as well. And Billy Hart talked about, he's like, oh yeah, that band was just totally financed by Herbie. Like he never really made any money. It was just impossible. Like you know, having all those people in the band, there was just no way. He said they would always drive. They had these incredibly long drives in Europe, and Herbie would drive. You know, he would drive this bus, you know, that had all their equipment on, and they'd always get there late because they're driving all over Europe. They'd get there late. Herbie would set up his roads and play a little bit while everybody else set up. Then they would play, and they did that night after night, just, you know, just really hitting the road hard. Like does not sound glamorous. And believe me, I know how unglamorous the road is, but this sounds like it was really not fun, you know. And then eventually Herbie said, I can't afford it. It's just, I'm just spending money. It's just so that's when he started to do Headhunters, because according to Billy Hart, the label said, look, stop doing M1Dishi. You're not making any money. But if you do something like Headhunters, you know, do something commercial, you know, we will really get behind it, you know. And so, but I really think, and I know we're going off on a lot of tangents, but I think one of the great things about Herbie is, you know, everything I've heard him do, he's able to really reconcile two elements, you know, the desire for, you know, mass appeal and really, you know, creativity with a certain amount of integrity, you know. He always puts his personal artistic stamp on it. You never feel like he's just selling out. It's like, oh, he's doing pop now. It doesn't, it still feels musical and artistic. There's always something kind of interesting in it that's like, that makes you think. But he's able to, like even the song Rocket, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. That was a huge hit, you know what I mean? That was you know, on MTV. But it's still very creative and interesting, you know what I mean? Especially the video. The video's really quite abstract, you know? So I really give him credit for being able to reconcile those two things. I think that's just you know, that's something I've always been kind of interested in, although I feel like, obviously I'm nowhere near as successful as Herbie Hancock, but it's something I've always been curious about, is how to reach people, but do it in a way that's on your terms, That's what I feel Herbie's always been able to do. And I feel like that's a very high artistic achievement, you know?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But anyway, yeah,
So,
the 90s
yeah.
were, like I said, I feel like I came in kind of on the tail end of something. Like it still felt as though there were a lot of opportunities. And certainly the tours that I was starting to do, you know, throughout the late 90s were always, you know, pretty substantial. I mean, I remember going to Europe 8 weeks, 9 weeks, 10 weeks, 11 weeks. I mean, I think the longest I was ever on the road for a single point was like almost 11 weeks in a row. I think we had a few days that fell out of the tour, but you know, 11 weeks on the road, that's, you know, I would sublet my apartment, you know, that type of thing. With Cassandra, I think we were out for 9 weeks total. And that was great. I mean, for somebody in their 20s, it's fantastic, you know, and, you know, just I mean, especially seeing how people responded to the music in Europe. It was just amazing, you know, like you really were treated well by promoters and the audience. And it was just like a dream. It was like, I couldn't believe my fortune, you know, to be able to do those great tours, you know, and certainly playing with Bart's. And then I was also playing with a vocalist named Vanessa Rubin. And she had a lot of work at the time. There used to be this tour called the Rising Star Tour, which was just another way of saying Young Lion. So this was a tour that essentially made Brad Meldau's career, that made Diana Krall's career. A number of people, Stefan Harris, you know, they were not as well known, and they did these tours, and it was sort of the beginning of their time, you know. So I did a bunch of those as a side person. I did one with Vanessa Rubin, I did one with Ingrid Jensen, and I did one with Lonnie Plaxico, and I did one with Steve Wilson, and boy, Melissa Walker. I know there's at least somebody else in there, but it was just, you know, basically it was mostly Germany, Switzerland, Austria, but sometimes it would start in Denmark, sometimes it would go to Sicily, you know, things like that. But it was great, just a great way to see Europe and to just get that experience. I really loved going to Europe all those years, you know. And again,
while you were
before,
there, George, did you have the opportunity to get out and play with other musicians in Europe, or were we mostly just like tied to a schedule?
Well, that happened at a certain point. I had this connection with Spain, and just to make the story short, not to be a bummer, but you know, when I moved to New York and I met a pianist named Mercedes Rossi, and you know, we became involved romantically, and then unfortunately she died of cancer towards the end of 1995 very suddenly. So that was a very traumatic experience. But I sort of maintained connections with Spain with some Spanish musicians. You know, her brother is a bass player named Mario Rossi. And so I was doing a bunch of things in Spain. We also had this project called the New York Flamenco Reunion, which is the brainchild of a drummer named Mark Maralta. And he had been one of my roommates in the first place that I lived, another Berkeley guy. And so we started doing this project where I was playing jazz standards with flamenco rhythms. And so we went to Spain and did a number of tours and playing around Madrid and Barcelona, a lot of stuff. So that's probably the most that I played with European musicians. In fact, 2 of my records for Fresh Sound used that group with a few little additions here and there. But I did a record called Desire. I did 3 records for Fresh Sound. One's called Unresolved, and that was with American guys. And then Desire, which was the Spanish group, Mark Maralta, Mario Rossi, and Perico Sambayat, who's a great alto player, really amazing guy. I really loved playing with him. And then we did another record called Como la Vida Puede Ser, which, you know, really incorporated some of the flamenco stuff. and I was really proud of that record. But yeah, so and then there were some other European cats that I played with. There's a Swiss trombonist named Christoph Schweitzer. We did a little tour with. He got Billy Hart, you know. So it's him and Ohad Talmor, great saxophone player, composer. Yeah, there was some other European cats here and there, but mostly I would say it was coming over with Americans, you know. But it's kind of a blur. It's like, even when I think back on it, it's like so many. I just played with so many bands. I was really like a mercenary, you know what I mean? Like, and I knew that I always had this feeling that I wanted to do my own stuff, you know. And I certainly got to do a lot of my own records as a leader for various labels, Steeplechase. You know, I did a few for Crisscross, Fresh Sound. You know, but in terms of the mechanism to really do it as a leader, I never was really able to develop that in a substantial way. And I sort of tried here and there, but when you're doing so many gigs as a side person, you know, it's hard to it's just hard to spend your time. And it's sort of too easy. It's like you as long as the phone's ringing, you know what I mean? It sort of makes you lazy for like trying to do your own stuff. And oftentimes I would get my own stuff. Like maybe I would get like one night at a club or one night at a festival. But then if somebody called me with 3 weeks worth of work, 4 weeks worth of work, I'd be like, man, I have to take whatever pays the most. There's just no way, you know? And so that, I always felt like I was putting my own stuff aside because of the needs for financial, you know, sensibility. You know what I'm saying? So just to kind of keep the thread going, you know, like I said, I was just working so much in, you know, from let's say 96 through 2001. It just seemed like I would say I was on the road about half the year. Like if you went day by day, like every other day of every year I would be on the road. So, which is good and bad. And I sort of remember 2001, May of 2001. I remember looking at my calendar. It's like just the sheer density of the work and the quality of it was really amazing. It was like I had some gigs with Ralph Peterson and Terrell Stafford and Don Byron and Lonnie Plaxico, and it just was like, I was like, there's no way this Ravi Coltrane, all in that 1 month. I was working with like all these heavy cats, and I was like, there's no way this could ever end. This is just a great way to make a living. You know, I probably didn't say it in those terms at the time, but like definitely thinking back on it, I was just like, this is how did I even get to this point? You know, I'm a mediocre trumpet player from Columbia, Maryland. There's no way. How did this happen? You know,
lots of work.
Well, yeah, I worked hard, but I definitely feel like I was in the right place at the right time. You know, there's people who play circles around me that.
Hang on. I mean, there's parts of that, but I think what a lot of people need to know, there's something to be said for being in the right time, the right place at the right time, but you also have the tools. You need to have the tools and the skill set and the experience and the ability when opportunity knocks so that you can take advantage of those opportunities.
Yes, I agree. I also think there's a certain kind of open-mindedness that I was always willing to take, and I still feel that way somewhat now, although obviously there isn't so much happening, but I sort of feel like maybe I will have to sort of narrow my intentions a little bit more as time goes on, getting into my 5th decade. But at the time I was sort of like, whatever came up, I would give it a shot. You know, the first time I played with Don Byron, you know, and I think Don is great. He's like a walking musical encyclopedia, and he's a great player. I got a lot of great opportunities from working with him. But also I learned a lot. I mean, so the first time I got called to play with him, his manager called me, Hans Vendel. And Hans said, oh, Don heard about you and he needs a pianist. Have you ever played Stravinsky's music? And, I've listened to Stravinsky, but I never really played, classical piano in public, So I was like, well, is it like arrangements or something? He's like, no, it's just this piece called Piano Rag Music, and then another piece called Owl and the Pussycat, and another piece called Septet. It's just playing that music. Can you do it? I was like, well, how hard could it be? It's like, if I have 3 months to work on it, and boy, was it hard. So that was definitely an education, and, we played a concert in some big classical hall in Vienna, and it was deep. I was nervous, but I got through it. And then Don just kept calling me, because for Don, it's like, you got to be able to play his music. So he just would call me for, at least 10 to 15 different projects, all with different interesting music. We did a project of the Sugar Hill Gang's music. We did a project that was Herb Alpert and Earth, Wind and Fire. We did his klezmer stuff. We did Duke Ellington stuff. We did the Raymond Scott stuff. He has a project called Bug. That's Bug music, but also the Six Musicians, which is more like Latin stuff. I did a trio that he had with Billy Hart. It was just a ton of music. We did some duo stuff. But a real education. And I felt like that's, essentially all that stuff, all those years is probably, that made the move sort of significant, the move to New York, because I really felt as though if I had stayed in Baltimore, Washington, I don't think I ever would have developed those kinds of experiences, just playing challenging music, a lot of different types of things, being exposed to stuff and being willing to go outside my comfort zone and just trying to absorb, I think that's the thing that, at least for now, and I don't know what the future holds, but even now, I think that you have that concentration in New York of all these serious players, and they all feel like, okay, this is my chance to really realize my aspirations on the highest level. And so all those people, that concentrated energy brings everybody up to their highest level. So if you go to any New York club, whether it's, the Blue Note or, the 55 Bar, you see people who are really playing like their life depends on it. You know what I mean? And it's like, you feel the difference, and it could be somebody famous. It could be somebody that just graduated from the new school. And you're like, holy crap. That's like, you walk into some jam session, like late night at Smalls. You're like, oh my God, that's the best alto player I've ever heard. And then somebody else gets up, oh no, that's the best alto player I've heard. And then somebody else gets up, but he's even better than those. You know what I mean? It's frightening, Yeah. And so that's, but you have to accept that. You just have to, you can't let that throw you. Look, when I moved to New York, I was competing with Moger Miller. I was competing with Kenny Barron. I was competing with Jeffrey Keyser, with all these great piano players. I was like, I'm going to have to compete with them, and maybe I'll end up just subbing for people, which I did. I subbed in a lot of bands. I subbed in Christian McBride's band here and there. I subbed in Stefan Harris's band. I subbed in Nicholas Payton's band, and those are all great experiences. I'm definitely, but I also, I worked hard, and I tried to always bring 110% and learn the music. But I also feel like I was lucky, and it's definitely word of mouth. Like, sort of once you get on that list, like that can snowball. Like it's sort of, okay, he's, and oftentimes it could be, not even like they've heard you, A lot of people think, oh, you got to give your music, you got to do a CD and then give it to somebody. There are a lot of players that I didn't really play with. Like I always thought that I would want to play with Dave Douglas. I liked his playing, and also he lived near me in Brooklyn. So I gave one of my CDs to his manager. I said, yeah, if Dave ever needs a pianist, and I never heard from him. So I remember telling that to Don Byron, who knew Dave, and I said, yeah, I gave a CD to Dave Douglas, but he never called me. He was like, you gave him a CD? You'll never get called. And I was like, what do you mean? It's like, oh, he said, if you crack on the gig, that means you're not going to get the gig. You never crack on the gig. You know what I'm saying? It's like the idea that you would put yourself out there is almost like antithetical to how you would be perceived. Like, this is why this is such a weird business. Again, most people, they get a degree and then they send in their application. They don't expect anybody to come to them. They know they have to send in their application, and then somebody reads it and then calls them in for an interview. Oftentimes in music, it doesn't work like that at all. It's like they would rather you just be this entity that they hear about. It's like very mysterious. I mean, I remember my father used to ask me when he was alive, it's like, how do you get these gigs? Do you have an agent? You need to get an agent. I'm like, I'm not an actor. I don't need an agent. He said, well, you need to get some. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way. He's like, well, how do you get called? I was like, well, people just call me. It's like, well, how do they know about you? I'm like, I don't know. I'm just on a list somewhere, I mean, and that's the thing. Oftentimes it's like you just have to get on that list. So I tell students that, sure, you can make a CD and that can be your calling card, blah, blah, blah. Oftentimes a CD really is just a calling card at this point. You're not going to make any money. It's just documentation. Who knows? Maybe your family and friends will buy a whole bunch of them, whatever. But sometimes it's better because if you give someone your CD, and let's say your CD is a very specific thing, even within jazz, they may not be able, it's almost like you give them too much of a clear picture of what you do, or what they think you do, or what you're sort of showing the world that you do based on this one thing, this one album, right? Like, for example, if somebody heard my album where I play drums, why would they call me to play piano? They wouldn't have any idea that I play piano. Or if I'm playing organ, or if I'm playing with a vocalist. And that's one thing that I will say kind of changed from the 90s to the 2000s was that, and it's funny because it happened right before I started playing with Cassandra Wilson. Like, I was playing with a lot of singers, tons of singers. And in Baltimore, Washington, I played with a lot of vocalists. And I kind of see now that was valuable, because a lot of musicians have no idea how to play with vocalists. And so I feel like I learned a lot of that. But at a certain point, I was like, if somebody comes and hears me with Vanessa Ruby, they hear me take half a chorus, they're never going to know that I can do more. And I was like, I got to figure out a way to play with more instrumentalists, And so I ended up, that's when I ended up getting the call for Cassandra. And I was like, well, I guess I got to do this, But then eventually I felt like I was working with more into the 2000s. It was definitely fewer vocalists, definitely more. And I felt like people were starting to be able to hear me,
Yeah. Well, George, I mean, we're getting close to time here, and I want to give the viewers an opportunity to ask questions. If there's anybody watching right now that has any questions for George, please let us know, and we'll get to those. And this is actually, I think, a good point to kind of break in the chronology of George Colligan, so we can pick up here at the next one, like into the 2000s. And again,
Man, I'm going so slow.
Questions here. I never get to any of the questions. Everything you say is great and it's very informative, and I love hearing about it. But I do have like very specific like musical questions for you too that I'm sure a lot of other people would like to know and benefit from your experiences. So at this time, anybody listening, does anyone have any questions? If not, maybe we can keep going into the early 2000s after Cassandra Wilson. So maybe what we'll do is, if you don't mind, George, we'll just talk for a couple minutes here. If any questions come in, then we'll deal with them. If not, we can just kind of call it and pick it next time. So,
okay, great.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so and like I was saying, I started playing with more instrumentalists. You know, I mean, essentially, like Lonnie Plaxico, the bass player, we were all sort of like forced out of Cassandra Wilson's band because Lonnie really wanted to do his own band, and he was starting to do that. Lonnie's, I mean, people may know him from, you know, he did a bunch of records with Art Blakey. He came to New York with Wynton Marsalis, played with Cassandra Wilson for many, many, many years, played with a bunch of other people, with Jack DeJohnette. But he's a really unique and brilliant composer that unfortunately, you know, he didn't, I don't think he really wanted to play the music business game. You know, he wanted to do it on his own terms. And I don't know, to me, it's kind of a bummer that he wasn't able to have his vision more realized. He did a number of records, and it was on Blue Note for a second, and we did a number of tours. We went to Europe, went to Japan, and people loved the band. It was usually a quintet, and it was, his music is a real hodgepodge. It's a very diverse, eclectic hodgepodge of things. There's you know, the jazz element. There's sort of like the Wayne Shorter heavy compositional element. There's a lot of funk and contemporary gospel influence. There's a pop strain in it. I mean, talk about a wide open musician, you know. And so you kind of had to have some awareness of all those things. I mean, I had to do some keyboard work, you know, clavinet, synths, you know, organ, that type of thing, and also read. I mean, it's like these 10-page charts that he would give you for every tune. It's incredible. I mean, and he had so many of these pieces. He was just sitting at home all day long writing these amazing works, you know, that also, again, it was like challenging music and interesting harmonically, really challenging harmonically. I mean, because he wouldn't write chord changes. He'd just write the voicing. So you kind of had to figure it out, you know. Sometimes we would all write our own changes in, you know.
Hang on one second. There's a couple questions that have come in, and we're going to pick up here where we left off. But I'm also trying to be, you know, careful of the time because we're getting close to the end here. But one is from a great drummer here. I don't know if you know him or not, but hopefully you'll get to play him if you haven't already. His name is Mark Ivester. He wants to know, when can we all play again? So that's an easy question.
When can we all play again? I don't think
have
I'm the one to ask.
Before?
Huh?
Have you met Mark before?
I think so.
I'm
not sure.
I think you guys would get along very well if you haven't met. But yeah, I think he's
ask
kind of
him. I'm trying to think. Where is he from?
He's from here. He lives in Gig Harbor. He's a wonderful drummer. He plays quite a bit with Greta Matassa and also with Jovino Santos Neto. He's a marvelous drummer.
Okay. I don't think we've played together, but that doesn't mean that we haven't.
Yeah. Well, there's another question here. What was your perception of Portland before moving here? And then it says, I remember you came here with Don Byron back in 2007 or so. Has that perception borne out? Well,
it's interesting because two places that I've moved to from New York, one was Winnipeg and the other was Portland. So both places pretty far outside my comfort zone. And I remember the first time I went to Winnipeg, it was like early 2000s. I went there with Stefan Harris, and it was May. It was maybe middle of May, and there was still snow on the ground. And I remember walking around, you know, the town, like downtown, and thinking, well, this is a real dump. You're like just not having a good feeling about it at all. And so the fact that I was convinced to move there, you know, really says something about how desperate I was for a teaching job at that point. But when I went to Portland in 2007 with Don, I remember that very vividly because we had a really nice show at the Schnitzer, the big theater. I think maybe it was the Winningstad. Really, really cool show. And I remember walking around downtown Portland thinking, this is great, man. This is a really nice place. I could see myself living here, you know, just, so now, I mean, I don't want to dump on Portland. I mean, especially since the federal officers have dumped on it enough lately, you know. But it's, you know, I mean, I'll say this, that one thing I like about New York is like, there's always this underlying feeling about New York of like, sort of like respecting why it's important and how special of a place it is. Especially when you go other places, you're like, well, New York has some things that no other place has, you know, the energy, the diversity, you know, the personality. But, you know, on the other hand, New Yorkers love to complain about it. And it's sort of, that's the price of admission. You know, you pay that much in rent, you should be able to complain. You know what I mean? It's like people complain about it, just, you know, oh, this city, you know, but they never leave. You know what I mean? They also know there's nowhere else for them to survive, you know, which is, you know, again, debatable. And a lot of people are moving out because it's so expensive, and maybe the character of the city is finally changing. But so I guess I'm sort of, I'm more of a realist, you know. I don't like to just sugarcoat things and be phony. It's just hard for me to do, you know. I don't want to be a bummer, but I don't feel like it's hard for me to lie and say something is amazing when it's not, you know, or that certain things are, because people who are from here, and I think maybe people who come here maybe from California, and they buy into the Portland mystique. And they're here for different reasons. And they're like, oh, we love it here, blah, 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 you know. So I see the good things, but I'm just the type of person, again, coming from New York, where it seems like fascism to me. It's like, you know, what? You don't like Portland? Why not? It's like, well, no place is perfect. You know what I mean? It's like, there's things about it I just don't that aren't for me, you know. I don't like being damp all the time.
Yeah,
that's normal, right?
This is a good segue, because there's a question from our mutual friend and wonderful drummer Stefan Schatz. Now, as you know, Stefan grew up and studied and lived in New York for all his life, and he recently moved here in the last couple of years, and we have these conversations as well. So you're probably on the same wavelength. But his question for you is, as a rhythm section player, can you speak a little bit about how you go about creating excitement and energy on the bandstand, soloing, comping, communicating, etc.?
Oh, Stefan, really? How much time do we have?
Well, we're already over by 5 minutes. I mean, we can address this later. And we're actually, for those watching, we're actually going to have George up here to do a gig in the near future. So we'll be doing another interview and an actual gig with Stefan. But feel free to speak to this question as much or as little as you'd like.
All right. Well, let me try to boil it down, and then I really have to go because I have a lesson. But well, it helps to have good partners in crime. That's for sure. So I think some of it just has to do with basic time, like just keeping a really solid. And, you know, when people talk about playing on top or whatever, that type of thing, I at least don't want it, like, you know, a lazy dragging beat is not something that I normally like, you know. And I don't know, now that I'm not playing so much, I'm sort of worrying about my own time, because you know, it's, you got to maintain it. If you really don't play at all, like, I think my sense of time is still good, but whether it's coming out in my fingers is to be debated at this point, you know. But I sort of remember this well, there's a bass player named Drew Gress who spent time in the Maryland area. He's originally, I think, from Pennsylvania, but he's essentially a Baltimore guy, you know. And we played a gig with Lenny Robinson, a drummer from DC, and I remember Drew saying, he's like, "Oh yeah, I could tell that Lenny spent some time in New York," you know what I mean? Because in terms of just that beat, you know, that intensity, that maintaining, the not letting you down feeling. And I think that's, aside from any kind of fancy tricks or, you know, some kind of, you know, complex interaction, I think just the excitement comes, and I'll say this, especially as somebody who's, you know, not always playing with top New York rhythm sections all the time, you know, and this is not to take anything away from cats out here, because there's some really good players in Portland who also have that experience. But when I go back and I play at Smalls with, you know, people like, you know, Donald Edwards or E.J. Strickland or you know, Jochen Ruckert or DeJohnette or Lenny White or, you know, whomever, you know, those types of players, it doesn't, the thing that's interesting is it doesn't have to be a lot. It can just be ting, 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 but it's that drive that you feel it right away. You're like, and you don't necessarily have to do anything fancy if the beat and the feel is really solid. Like, I think sometimes people sort of overplay because they're like, well, I got to create excitement. It's like, if you don't just have that good time feel, then any extra stuff, it's sort of like making a mess of it because you don't have a good foundation. You know what I mean? It's not going to be stable. It's going to be sort of annoying. You know what I mean? Because again, you could play a whole bunch of stuff, but if it doesn't come back to just a really solid time feel, you know, and it's just, and I'm not even saying that I am the one to bring it. I just know that when I feel it, that I'm excited by that.
Right.
And so
I would agree 100%. And when we play with you, when we come down to Portland, or when we have you come up here to play with us, your sense of time and creativity, and we've talked about this, you know, when you're gone, but you push us to play better. We play better when we play with you because of the way that you're feeling the time. And we've all talked about this, how, you know, we want to play with like-minded musicians moving in the same direction. And when you have that and the strong sense of time, you feel it on the bandstand amongst yourselves, and the audience feels that. It's a tangible thing, you know. So, yeah.
I think it's so important, and unfortunately, I feel like maybe because I've sort of always had it very naturally that I'm not the best person to teach it. You know, I think I can point people in the right direction, and I can say your time isn't good, or it doesn't feel right, or, you know, and it's really very, and in some ways it's a game of inches, because you can feel like, but I'm doing it, I'm playing with the metronome, you know, you're right with the metronome, but that still doesn't mean that when that are you going to bring the metronome to the gig? You know, who's in a way that's you got to be able to do it without a metronome. You know what I mean? Like, so can you do that? So like, can you, because there is consistent accurate time. That also doesn't necessarily mean it's going to feel great.
Right.
You know, you might say, okay, I'm playing with the metronome, but it still doesn't. So in a way, it's that drive and that playfulness within the beat, and just sort of understanding how rhythm works from one beat to the next, and be able to listen to each other and keep that. One of the things that I think is the main reason, and this is, I think, for any of the serious drummers who come out of New York or who understand that feeling. but especially from DeJohnette. Like DeJohnette, the reason I think he was so in demand is not because he's got a whole bunch of chops or because he's flashy, but because he never lets you down. He keeps playing. He keeps the energy up no matter what, and he's just sensitive to that. And you never feel like, oh, like it's always, no matter how. If you wanted to play 100 choruses, he would keep playing. He would be able to propel you to that. I mean, I've told this story before, but when I was playing with him, and he didn't say a lot, but I remember before one of the gigs, he said, maybe we should try to play shorter solos so that we could play more of our tunes. And I said, well, you're going to have to sound worse then. And at first he didn't, it was like, what? And then he knew I was joking. I was like, you play too good. Nobody wants to stop playing. You know what I mean? It's like, maybe swing less, whatever. Just don't sound as good. Like, I mean, if it didn't sound good, maybe we would stop. But like, I'm just like playing with those kind of rhythm sections. And I feel the same with Buster and Lenny. Like, it just could go on forever because it just feels great. But that's within one measure. You feel that. You're like, okay. And I think ultimately that's why people stay on the scene in New York, because they are addicted to that feeling, So
yeah, well, I think totally, and I think also not only that, but I think people that really, like, some people don't know jazz, or they've come to jazz, or jazz in 2020 means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But when they feel that that energy from the bandstand amongst the musicians and amongst themselves as the audience, that's what kind of captures them. I mean, it's a different thing to feel that and experience it live than it is to a recording. And when you have that, as a musician, speaking my own opinion, my own personal opinion, it's like a drug, and you want to replicate that experience again and again and again, and play with guys and gals, musicians that make you feel that. So that's, yes, and I think, like you said, you should trademark that saying. We talked about it in the subway, being in New York. I'm here for the jazz. They're there for the jazz. So.
Yeah.
Anyway,
sure.
I'm going to be respectful of your time. I know you got a lesson. Thank you so much for doing this today. Thank you for everybody who tuned in and watched and listened. If you have questions, put them in the feed. We can, if we didn't get to them now, we'll try to get to them later. We will be doing some more of these with George, because I've got like 30 questions and we've answered none of them. But this has all been great, and you always have wonderful things to say, and we appreciate your experiences. Do you have any projects or streams or anything you want people to know about that are coming up in the near future?
Well, I'm going to do my regular Sunday concert. Actually, I think I forgot to post it, but I'm going to do that tomorrow at 2. And that's mostly what I'm doing. I mean, I have a few things locally, outdoor type of things, but hopefully we'll be able to do our Sunday thing at some point.
Yeah. We'll schedule, and what we'll do is, when you come up here to do the gig, we'll do a live interview here, and then also the concert too. But we'll sort that out, and we'll post about that. In the near future, we'll figure it out and let people know. But thank you for your time, and thanks everybody for tuning in and listening, and see you again soon. Have a good one.
All right, thanks everybody. Bye.